Hello friends. In this lesson we're going to talk about how to understand numbers in English. Now numbers are one of the most basic things in any language. We use them all the time. Whether you're checking the weather or shopping or doing some math or reading the news, they're all over the place and they can come in many different forms. So when you're learning a language, one of the most useful things you can do is to understand the numbers in that language, especially when you're listening to them. Because when you're listening, people can go pretty fast with numbers. So it can get confusing or hard to understand. So in this lesson, we're going to look at some of the different kinds of numbers in English and focus on some tips and tricks for understanding them when people are talking fast. So the first set of numbers here are the whole numbers, and these are the most basic ones. So that's 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And then we have 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100. So these are the ones that everybody knows. Now, one thing with the number 0 is that sometimes people will say O instead of 0, and that's usually when people are giving phone numbers. So for example, if I was saying this phone number, I would say 202-456-1111. So we're saying each of the numbers individually, except for 0, we're saying O instead of 0. Sometimes people might say 202 if they're trying to be very clear. But more often than not, people will say like 202-456-1111. Now, often when people are giving phone numbers, like I said, they'll say the numbers individually, but they will usually pause in between the number groups. So they'll say the first 3 numbers together, the area code. So they'll say 3 numbers, pause, 3 more numbers, pause, and then they'll say the last 4 numbers. But with the last 4 numbers, we can say these a couple different ways. We can say them in 2 number groups or as a whole group. So for this number, I would say 202-456-1414 or 202-456-1414. So a native speaker would say this a couple different ways. For a number like this, we might say 877-450-3322, or we could say 877-450-3322, or 877-450-3322. So there's a few different ways that somebody would say this, but usually with these last 4 numbers, we would group them in sets of 2 when we're pausing in between. So we would pause after the first 3, pause after the second 3, and then 2, and then 2. For a number like this, where the last 4 numbers make a kind of a rounded number, we might say 651-201-3400, 651-201-3400, or 651-201-3400, if somebody wanted to be really specific. But often people would say 3,400 because this is a rounded number. And the same thing for this one, 651-201-3000. So rather than saying 3000, which could sound confusing, if we're saying it quickly, people will just say 3,000 or 5,000 or 1,000 for the phone number. So 651-201-3000. So whole numbers are very simple numbers, but when we're hearing them in a series, like in a phone number, they can get a little bit tricky. And if you have to listen to a phone number and write it down quickly, it's good to have practice with listening in this way. Another tricky thing with whole numbers are the teens versus the tens in English, because they sound very similar. So the teens are 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, and 19. The tens are 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90. Now, when you're listening to these, they can sound very similar, especially if you're on the phone. So one trick that you can use to tell the difference is to listen to the last part of the number. So we've got the number 13 and the number 30, and they're going to be pronounced a little bit differently at the end. So the teen, you'll hear clearly the T sound, and sometimes you'll hear the N sound pretty clearly. So 13, 30. Now notice for the tens, this T sound in the middle will get changed into a D sound. So we'll say 13, 30, 14, 40, 15, 50, 16, 60, 17, 70, 18, 80, 19, 90. So you can hear the D sound and you won't hear any N sound here. With the teen, you'll hear an N sound at the end usually. So listen to the ending of the number and that will help you a lot. If you're not clear, if somebody's talking to you on the phone and you're not clear what they're trying to say, then you can clarify by saying, is that 1-3 or 3-0? And that's usually how people will clarify. Even native speakers will ask that question if they're having a hard time, because on the phone, sometimes the connection is not clear. When we're getting into the hundreds and the thousands, there are a couple of ways that we can say some of the numbers. So we have the number 100. This is how we would spell it. This is how we write it, obviously. But most of the time, people won't say 100. They'll say 100, like this, 100. I have $100, not $100. Now, and one, they mean the exact same thing, but this way is shorter. If we are having more in the 10 spot, so like 150, we could say 150. This is how we would spell it formally. But when we're saying it, people will normally say 150, like this, 150. We won't say the word and as a full word. You'll just hear this N sound in the middle. 150, 160, 170, 153. When we're getting into the thousands, it's kind of the same thing if we have one. So if we have 1,000, this is how we would spell it formally. But when we're saying it, we would say 1,000. I want $1,000, so 1,000. If we have any hundreds in there as well, we would say formally 1,500, but when people are talking, they'll just say 1,500. So this is something with the thousands. We can either say it as 1,000 or we can say it in terms of 100. So you could say 1,500, 1,600, 2,500. So if I say 2,500, then I mean 2,500. So I could say 2,500 or I could say 2,500. And since it's a little bit easier to say 2,500, that's how people will say it most of the time. We can do this counting by hundreds in the thousands all the way up to 9,999. So once we get to 10,000, we don't say like 100. We would keep it under 10,000. So technically, formally, we would say 9,999 for this number, or we could say 9,999. Another thing with the thousands is that we can sometimes use letters or other words to describe it being 1,000. So this number here, 2,000, this is how we would spell it. But sometimes people will say 2K. The K stands for Kil, K-I-L, and I think it's Latin, and that means 1,000. So instead of saying 2,000, they'll say 2K. Now, why would you say 2K instead of 2,000? Well, if you count the number of syllables, 2,000, that's three syllables. But if I say 2K, that's only 2 syllables. When people talk, people try to say things as quickly and as easily as possible. So if they can use fewer syllables, then they'll shorten what they're saying somehow. So we could say 2K, and that'll make it shorter than saying 2,000. For example, when the year 2000 came, people kept talking about Y2K. So that's the year 2000, so Y2K. Once we get into the 100,000s, we can say like 100K, like this, 100K, or 100,000 or 100,000. When we're talking about money, we could say $100,000, or we could say 100K, or here's a different one, we could say 100 grand. So when people are talking about money, then we can also use this word grand to mean 1,000. So somebody could say, oh, I make over 100 grand a year. So they mean they make over $100,000 a year, more than that. When we're getting into the millions and more, so the millions, the billions, and the trillions, there's a few different ways that people will talk about those numbers when they're speaking. So we have a million, so we could say 1 million, but people will normally say a million. If we have more than a million, Formally, we would say 1,500,000, like here, or people might say 1.5 million. So they're taking 1,500,000 equals 1.5 million. So this is easier to say than this one, which is much longer. So they'll start counting in point. 1.5 million, 1.6 million, 2.3 million. When we get into a billion, it's the same thing as a million. So 1 billion or a billion. Now, it's not the same number, but instead of saying one, people will say a. So a billion. And when we're getting into increments of a billion, instead of saying 1,500,000,000, it's easier to say 1.5 billion. So these numbers are equal to each other. 1,500,000,000 equals 1.5 billion. For example, we can say Jeff Bezos has a net worth of about 182 billion. So instead of saying 182 billion, I would say 182 billion. So Jeff Bezos has a net worth of about $182 billion. So when you're saying it quickly, you got to listen clearly to what people are saying. So 182 billion equals 182 billion. That's actually what he's worth. That's how much money he has in various forms. So we could say Jeff Bezos is a billionaire. So a billionaire is somebody who has over $1 billion. A millionaire is somebody who has over $1 million. Trillionaire, I don't think there's anybody that has $1 trillion, but we do use the number trillion. This usually we use when we're talking about national budgets for entire countries or some states in the United States. For example, like California or New York, they probably have budgets close to $1 trillion. I have no idea, actually. So 1 trillion or a trillion, or we could say $4,450 billion, right? So that's a lot to say. 4 billion or $4,450 billion. That's a long number. Instead, people will say 4.45 trillion. 4.45 trillion. So in 2019, the U.S. federal government spent $4.45 trillion. And this is true. It's a lot of money. The next kind of numbers we're going to look at here are ordinal numbers. So ordinal numbers are called ordinal because they go in order. So ordinal comes from the word order. So when we put things in an order, we use ordinal numbers. So the ordinal numbers are 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, 20th, 100th, 1000th, millionth, on and on and on. So you'll notice here for the ordinal numbers, when we're writing them shorthand, you'll see just like the number 1 and then ST, or the number 2 and ND. So first, so that's why we have the ST there. Second, that's why we have the ND, because the end on the end. Third, so we have the letter, the number 3 and the letters RD, so third. But after first, second, and third, we just use the TH. So 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, etc. So the first 3 are the only ones that are different with the 2 letters we use as the ordinal. Now, when we're spelling them, here's how we spell them. But when we're writing them, people will use the shorthand form, which is this one here. And these get used a lot with calendar dates. Now, you can do this with any number in English. You can just add a TH at the end if it's a very large number. Fractions are when we divide something into pieces. So some common fractions are 1/2 or 1/3 or 1/4. So here's the shorthand writing of them with the numbers. Now, if we're actually spelling them out, this is how we're going to spell them, like 1/2, 1/3, 1/4. But when we're speaking, people will usually say half or a half. So you'll notice here, every time with these numbers, we're saying the number 1. When we're speaking, we'll normally say a, so a half. Can I have a half a cup of coffee, right? I don't know why anybody would ask for a half a cup of coffee. If you're going to have coffee, you might as well have a whole cup. Anyway, so 1/3, we would say a third. 1/4, we would say a fourth, or we could say a quarter. For 1/5, we would say a fifth. But once we start getting into other numbers, instead of 1, we have 2/5, so that's 2/5. 3/5, that's 3/5. Now look at this one. we have 5 over 9. So how would we say that in English, do you think? So as a fraction, we would say 5/9, right? So you'll see that the first number, we just use the whole number. And the second number, we use the ordinal number. So fifth, 9th for the second number in the fraction. For decimals, that's when we have the little point here. So we're dealing with less than a whole number. So for this number, we would say 0.1. For this one, we would say 0.5. People normally won't say 0. They won't say like 0.1 or 0.5. They'll just say 0.1 or 0.5. 98.6, which is the average body temperature of a human being, or 6.12. For percentages, here's how we'll write them. So we've got the number and then the percent sign. I know in some countries, they will put the percent sign first, but in American English, we will put the percent sign after the number. So we have 10%, 25%, 50%, up to 100%, which is the highest you can go. But in sports, for some reason, or work, people might say 110%. Like, I want you to give 110%, which obviously you can't have 110%. But people will say that anyway. It means I want you to give more than you think you can give. Now, each of these numbers, the fractions, the decimals, and the percentages, can be equal to each other. So they're just different ways of writing the same number meaning. So for example, 1/2 or a half equals 0.5, which equals 50%. Or a third equals 0.333, repeating, equals 33%. A quarter equals 0.25 equals 25%. A fifth equals 0.2 or 20%. And a tenth equals 0.1 or 10%. Now, we can go very easily from the decimal to the percentage just by moving the decimal place over 2 spaces. And then it would go there, and that would be your percentage, right? So if we have 0.5, we move it over 2 times. So we have the 0 there. So we've got 50%. Or we move it over here. So there's our percentage sign. So 25%. So going from a decimal to a percentage is pretty easy, but sometimes it can get confusing if you're having to switch between these 3 numbers. Now, the reason I'm pointing this out is if, for example, you're listening to a news story or a weather report or something like that, the person who's speaking might switch back and forth between fractions and percentages and decimals. So you've got to be able to convert between the 3 to understand what they're trying to say, right? So if they said a fifth of the U.S. population, you know, you have to realize that a fifth equals like 20% of the population if you want to be able to understand what they're saying very easily. Another group of numbers here are the ratios. So this is when we're comparing numbers. So if we say 1 out of 2 or 2 out of 3 or 6 and 10 or 1 and 5, we would note those numbers like this. We'll use a colon in between. So 1 out of 2 or 2 out of 3 or 6 out of 10 or 6 in 10 or 1 in 5 or 1 out of 5. So we could either say out of or we could say in. They're both meaning the same thing, and we're representing them like this, the 2 numbers with the colon symbol in between them. For example, about 1 in 5 U.S. adults say they use Twitter. So 1 in 5 would be that right there. So 1 in 5 adults use Twitter. So if you're taking notes, you know, rather than writing 1 in 5, you could just use this number abbreviation over here. 1 in 5 adults say they use Twitter. So if we're saying 1 in 5, then what we're saying is about 20% of adults. So being able to convert back and forth very quickly can be very helpful if you're taking notes. Another group of numbers are dates. And like I mentioned before, when we're giving dates, we usually use the ordinal number for the number day in the month. So, you know, months can have 30 days or 31 days, except the month of February, which will have, you know, 28 or 29 days, depending on the year. So when we're giving dates, we would put them in the ordinal numbers. So like April 15th, we would spell it maybe like this, but write it shorthand like this, 15th, or July 4th. So April 15th in the U.S. is tax day. It's when your taxes are due. And July 4th is Independence Day. So we could say July 4th, or we could say the 4th of July. We could say April 15th, or we could say the 15th of April. They both mean the same thing. It's just two different ways of saying the same date. Now, if we're talking about weeks in a month, we could say like the first week of November or the last week of November, the third week in November, the second week in November. So we can also use ordinals to count the weeks in a month if we're talking about a week, a specific week. When we get into counting groups of years or dates together, there's a couple of other groups that we use. The first one is decades. So a decade means 10 years. If you see this DEC, it comes from a Latin root, which means 10. So a decade is a group of 10 years. So when people are talking about decades, they'll talk about, for example, the 50s or the 60s or the 70s or the 80s or the 90s or the 20s or the 30s. So that means, for example, if I say the 50s, I could write it like that, or I could use the shorthand number. So you're just using the number and adding S after it. So that would mean the years like 50 to 59. So it's all of those years together. Or the 60s would be 60 to 69. So we could say like the 1870s or the 1970s. So if I say the 1870s, I mean 1870 through 79. If I say the 1970s, that's 1970 through 79. So when I'm giving a year, I will usually give the numbers in two groups. I'll give the first two numbers together and the second two numbers together. So 1870s, 1970s. When we talk about centuries, we're talking about groups of 100 years, because a century, the cent, comes from a Latin root, which means 100, like percent, right? So per 100. So a century is 100 years. So when we're talking about centuries, we could say like the 1500s or the 1600s or the 1700s or the 2000s. Now, another way that people will talk about these centuries is by saying like using the ordinal number, the first century, the second century, the 8th century, the 16th century, the 21st century. This can get a little bit confusing because when we're talking about a century this way, we have to basically go up one number. So if I say the 100s, then I'm talking about the second century. The reason is because if we're counting from the year 0 to 99 would be the first century. So because of that, like if I talk about the 700s, that is the 8th century. So if I'm talking about the 1500s, that's the 16th century. If I'm talking about the 2000s, that's the 21st century. So when you're listening to people talk about the such and such century, you kind of have to count backwards. Okay. If they say the 10th century, that means the 900s. And then one last thing to note when we're talking about centuries and dates is the numbering systems. Like, so when we say the 8th century or the 16th century, which calendar are we talking about? Which way of figuring out years? So in the West, in Europe and in America, we use these designations to talk about centuries. So we're marking generally from the birth of Jesus. So you'll see BC and you'll see AD if you're looking at older books or older newspapers. So this one will pronounce it as BC, like this. This one will pronounce as AD, like this. So the BC stands for before Christ, and the AD does not mean after death. It means Anno Domini, which is Latin for in the year of our Lord. So basically counting from when Jesus was a year old or whatever. Now, because this is from the Christian calendar, and when we're using this calendar in other places that aren't Christian, they try to be more politically correct about it. So they will use BCE instead of BC, or they'll use CE instead of AD. So if you see CE, it's the same thing as AD. If you see BCE, it's the same thing as BC. So the CE stands either for the Christian era or the Common Era. So if you look at a newer history book or a newer journal article, you'll probably see these designations instead of AD or BC. If you look at older ones, you'll generally see BC and AD. So this, when you're listening, can get a little bit confusing because of this one right here, AD, because AD sounds like the number 80. So if, for example, somebody is saying in the year 80 AD, it sounds like they're just repeating 80 over again. So if you hear AD, be careful because they might be using this and not talking about the number 80. So that's it for this lesson on numbers. Hopefully it was helpful for you. Thanks for watching.